They trained him to observe royalty with surgical precision. He had studied queens and princesses across every court in Europe. But when the Venetian ambassador heard Elizabeth Assur speak for the first time, his hand trembled as he wrote an encrypted dispatch back to Venice. What he documented about her voice was so disturbing that it remained buried in sealed archives for centuries. 7 words from another diplomat about what he heard would end his career within days. What happens when a trained intelligence operative witnesses something that defies every rule he's been taught about human nature? The Venetian ambassador to England in 1560 wasn't a casual observer making polite small talk at court functions. This man had spent his entire adult life in the most sophisticated intelligence network in Renaissance Europe. Trained from his early 20s in the art of reading people, assessing threats, and documenting royal characteristics with clinical precision. Venice didn't send amateurs to foreign courts. They sent men who could distinguish between a cough that meant tuberculosis and one that meant poison, who could read political alliances in the way monarchs positioned themselves at dinner, who understood that a queen's fertility prospects could determine whether Venice backed England or Spain in the next war. This particular ambassador had observed the courts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and half a dozen Italian city-states before arriving in London. He had written detailed reports on dozens of queens, princesses, and noblewomen, documenting everything from their complexion to their gait to their conversational style. He knew exactly what royal women looked like, how they moved, and most importantly, how they sounded. His reports were so valued in Venice that the Doge himself read them personally, trusting this man's observations to guide Venetian foreign policy across Europe. When he arrived in England to assess the new queen, Elizabeth I, he expected another routine diplomatic assignment. His first private audience with Elizabeth lasted less than 20 minutes. But when he returned to his quarters that evening, he sat at his desk for over an hour before he could bring himself to write his report. Witnesses who saw him emerge from the Queen's presence chamber noted that his face had gone pale and he walked with unusual stiffness, as if he'd received shocking news. When he finally put quill to paper, his hand trembled slightly, something servants who brought him wine commented on later. The dispatch he sent to Venice that night was written in the most sophisticated cipher available, a code so complex that it took 2 expert cryptographers in Venice 3 days to fully decode it. He didn't use this level of encryption for normal diplomatic observations. This cipher was reserved for intelligence that could trigger wars, reveal assassination plots, or expose state secrets that could destabilize governments. In that encrypted message, he described Elizabeth's voice as unusually loud and possessing a masculine manner of speaking. But these clinical phrases barely captured what had clearly disturbed him deeply. He added details that subsequent historians have puzzled over for centuries, noting that her voice carried a quality that unsettles the natural order, and that hearing her speak created disquiet in the mind of the observer. This wasn't the language of a diplomat cataloging interesting characteristics. This was a trained professional struggling to describe something that violated his understanding of fundamental reality. The Venetians' report landed in Venice like a diplomatic grenade, and within weeks the Doge had dispatched a second observer to England under cover of trade negotiations, tasked with one specific mission: verify what the ambassador had heard. That verification came back positive with even more disturbing details. The second observer noted that Elizabeth's voice didn't just sound masculine in volume or authority, it possessed acoustic qualities that were wrong for a woman of any station. He wrote that listening to her speak for extended periods created a cognitive dissonance, as if the mind couldn't reconcile what the eyes saw with what the ears heard. The Venetian intelligence network began circulating these observations to their allies, and suddenly courts across Europe were paying very close attention to reports about the English Queen's voice. But this was just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge from multiple independent sources, each one more troubling than the last. What these professional observers were documenting wasn't just unusual, it was impossible according to everything they understood about human biology. To understand why these reports were so explosive, you need to understand exactly who Renaissance ambassadors were and how they operated. These men weren't politicians who gave speeches and attended parties. They were the 16th century equivalent of deep cover intelligence agents, and their training was extraordinarily sophisticated. From their teenage years, future ambassadors were educated in a curriculum that included medicine, anatomy, psychology, languages, cryptography, and what we would now call behavioral analysis. They studied under physicians to learn how to assess health and fertility at a glance. They trained with actors to understand how vocal patterns revealed emotion, deception, and psychological state. They memorized the physical characteristics and family traits of every major European dynasty so they could assess parentage and identify potential imposters. A competent ambassador could walk into a room, observe a queen for 30 minutes, and write a report that accurately predicted her fertility prospects, assessed her likelihood of surviving childbirth, evaluated her mental stability, and determined whether she was being poisoned or suffering from natural illness. These skills weren't optional curiosities. They were essential survival tools in an era when backing the wrong monarch could get your entire city-state invaded. The Venetian ambassador who first documented Elizabeth's voice had previously written detailed assessments of Catherine de' Medici of France, Mary of Guise in Scotland, and Isabella of Portugal. His reports on these queens included precise observations about vocal pitch, speaking patterns, and how their voices compared to other women of their class. He noted Catherine's voice as sharp but feminine, Mary's as soft with occasional force, and Isabella's as melodious in the Spanish fashion. These weren't generic descriptions, they were technical assessments that other diplomats and royal courts could verify and trust. When he described a queen's voice as feminine, it meant something specific, a certain tonal range, a particular way of projecting authority without violating gendered expectations of speech, a quality that matched the physical presence of a woman's body. His assessments had been proven accurate dozens of times over years of diplomatic service. His credibility was unquestioned in Venice and respected across European courts. So when this same man with this proven track record wrote that Elizabeth's voice possessed a masculine manner of speaking, it wasn't a casual observation or a poetic flourish. It was a clinical diagnosis from an expert witness that something fundamental was wrong. What made these diplomatic observers even more credible was that they had no political incentive to lie or exaggerate about Elizabeth. Venice was neutral in most English affairs, more interested in trade routes than royal scandals. The Venetian Republic actually benefited from a stable, powerful England that could challenge Spanish dominance in the Atlantic. If anything, Venice had every reason to downplay any observations that might destabilize Elizabeth's reign, or give ammunition to her Catholic enemies who already questioned her legitimacy. Yet despite these political incentives to remain silent or minimize their observations, multiple Venetian ambassadors felt compelled to document what they heard. The fact that they reported these disturbing details despite having good reasons not makes their testimony even more powerful. These were professionals who understood the consequences of their words, who knew that casting doubt on a reigning monarch's legitimacy could have massive diplomatic repercussions. Yet they filed reports anyway because what they observed was so undeniable that professional integrity demanded documentation. The pattern that was emerging from multiple courts suggested something far more systematic than individual bias or misunderstanding. But if the Venetian reports were troubling, what emerged from the Spanish court was absolutely devastating. In 1559, a Spanish envoy was granted a private audience with Elizabeth to discuss potential marriage negotiations between the English Queen and King Philip II of Spain. This was supposed to be routine diplomatic theater, the kind of meeting that happened constantly as European powers jockeyed for advantageous alliances. The Spanish envoy was a career diplomat named Gómez Suárez de Figueroa, a man who had successfully negotiated treaties in France, Portugal, and the Vatican. He was known for his discretion, his political acumen, and his ability to navigate complex negotiations without creating diplomatic incidents. He had observed dozens of potential royal brides on behalf of Spanish interests, writing detailed assessments of their suitability, their political value, and their likelihood of producing heirs. When he arrived in England to assess Elizabeth, he expected another standard evaluation. The meeting lasted approximately 40 minutes, during which Elizabeth spoke at length about English foreign policy, her views on religious matters, and the theoretical terms under which she might consider a Spanish marriage. The envoy listened, asked appropriate questions, and maintained the diplomatic composure expected of someone in his position. But when he returned to his quarters at the Spanish embassy, he did something unprecedented in his 30-year diplomatic career. He requested an immediate private courier to Madrid, bypassing normal diplomatic channels that would have sent his report with the next scheduled messenger. He paid for this courier out of his own funds, an enormous expense that suggested desperate urgency. The message he sent was so heavily encrypted that it used a cipher known only to the Spanish king and his most trusted intelligence advisors. When that message reached Madrid, Philip II read it personally, and within 72 hours the envoy received orders to return to Spain immediately. He left England within a week, abandoning ongoing negotiations and diplomatic relationships he had spent months cultivating. He never worked as a foreign ambassador again. The contents of that encrypted dispatch remained sealed in Spanish archives for over 300 years. But when historians finally accessed it in the 19th century, they discovered why it had ended the envoy's career so abruptly. In the message, he had written a single sentence that was so disturbing, so potentially explosive, that the Spanish court decided immediate extraction was the only safe response. That sentence read, "Her Majesty's form is not as other women's." Just 7 words, but those 7 words carried devastating implications. The word form in diplomatic language of the era was highly specific. It didn't mean personality, it didn't mean behavior, and it didn't mean political stance. Form meant physical body, the actual biological structure of a person. When the envoy wrote that Elizabeth's form was not as other women's, he was making a clinical observation about her physical nature, something he had observed directly that violated his expectations of female anatomy or presentation. The phrasing was careful, probably deliberately vague to protect himself if the message was intercepted, but it was specific enough that Philip II understood immediately what was being implied. Whatever the envoy had seen or heard during that 40-minute meeting had convinced him that Elizabeth's physical body didn't match what was expected of a woman. The Spanish court's reaction tells you everything about how seriously they took this intelligence. They didn't demand clarification, they didn't ask for more details. They didn't send another observer to verify the claim. They extracted their ambassador immediately and shut down any further discussion of a Spanish marriage to Elizabeth. Philip II, who had been genuinely considering marrying Elizabeth for both political and religious reasons, abandoned those plans within weeks of receiving the dispatch. More tellingly, Spanish diplomats began quietly sharing warnings with other Catholic courts about the irregular nature of the English queen, using coded language that suggested they possessed damaging intelligence about her physical condition. The Vatican received reports from Spanish sources that raised questions about whether Elizabeth was formed properly for the duties of a wife, another carefully worded phrase that implied biological irregularities. These weren't random gossips spreading rumors, these were official diplomatic channels, transmitting intelligence that was being taken seriously at the highest levels of European power. The Spanish had discovered something concrete enough to completely reverse their foreign policy regarding England, and that something was related to Elizabeth's physical form. But the Spanish envoy's 7 words weren't the only evidence that something was terribly wrong. What's truly terrifying is that his observation was part of a pattern emerging from multiple independent sources who had no contact with each other and no reason to coordinate their stories. A French ambassador reported in 1564 that Elizabeth possessed more the bearing of a soldier than a lady, specifically noting how she moved, stood, and gestured during audiences. The French court's master of ceremonies, a man whose entire job was understanding court protocol and proper aristocratic behavior, added his own observations about how Elizabeth's physical presence disrupted normal social dynamics. He noted that male courtiers instinctively deferred to her in ways that went beyond respect for monarchy, almost as if responding to physical dominant signals that were inappropriate coming from a woman. A German diplomat sent to negotiate trade agreements wrote that observing Elizabeth in person created confusion of the senses, as if his mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. An envoy from the Holy Roman Empire documented that her movements were altogether too assured and masculine in their confidence. These reports weren't just noting that Elizabeth was an unusually confident or assertive woman. Renaissance courts were full of powerful women who wielded political authority, made life and death decisions, and commanded respect from male subordinates. Diplomats had observed Catherine de' Medici orchestrating French politics, Isabella of Castile, who had funded Columbus and conquered Granada, and Mary of Hungary, who governed the Netherlands for decades. These women were politically powerful, intellectually formidable, and completely comfortable exercising authority. Yet none of them generated the kind of confused, disturbed reports that ambassadors sent home about Elizabeth. The difference wasn't political power or personality. It was something about physical presence that violated observers' fundamental expectations. When a trained diplomat with decades of experience observing royalty across Europe writes that someone's form is not as other women's, when multiple independent observers from different nations all report similar confusion about physical characteristics, when professional intelligence operatives struggle to find language to describe what they're witnessing, you're not dealing with subjective interpretation. You're dealing with something objectively observable that was consistent enough to disturb multiple trained professionals. The pattern becomes even more undeniable when you realize these observations came from men whose careers depended on accuracy. A diplomat who filed false or exaggerated reports damaged his own credibility and could trigger disastrous foreign policy decisions. If a Venetian ambassador reported that a queen was infertile when she wasn't, and Venice made strategic decisions based on that false intelligence, the ambassador would be held accountable when the queen produced an heir. These men didn't speculate wildly or make dramatic claims for entertainment. They reported what they observed with as much clinical precision as possible, because their professional reputations and sometimes their lives depended on accuracy. The fact that multiple ambassadors working independently from nations with different political interests all documented similar disturbing observations about Elizabeth's voice, physical form, and presence creates a weight of evidence that's impossible to dismiss. Something about Elizabeth's physical nature was observable enough that trained professionals felt compelled to document it, despite the diplomatic complications their reports would create. But here's what makes the diplomatic reports absolutely chilling when you examine them closely. They all circle around the same central observation without quite stating it directly. The Venetian writes about her masculine voice. The Spanish envoy references her form being wrong for a woman. The French note her soldiers bearing. The Germans describe confusion of the senses. Each report is carefully worded, almost deliberately vague, as if the observers are afraid to state clearly what they actually suspect. This pattern of circumlocution, of describing symptoms without naming the diagnosis, suggests these diplomats understood exactly what they were observing but knew that stating it directly would be too explosive. In diplomatic correspondence of the era, this kind of careful language usually appeared when ambassadors needed to report something that could trigger wars or international incidents if stated bluntly. They were trained to communicate sensitive intelligence through implication and coded language. When you see multiple diplomats all using this same careful, circling language around Elizabeth's physical characteristics, it suggests they all reached the same conclusion about what they were observing, but none of them dared write it explicitly in documents that might be intercepted or read by hostile powers. The silence is as revealing as the words. What's remarkable about these diplomatic reports is what they don't say as much as what they do. Not one ambassador suggested Elizabeth was simply an unusually tall woman, or an especially confident speaker, or someone with an unusually deep voice within normal female range. They don't compare her to other powerful women they'd observed. They don't suggest her characteristics are within the spectrum of female variation, just at the extreme end. Instead, they use language that suggests categorical difference, not variation within type. A masculine manner of speaking isn't just a loud voice or an authoritative tone. It's a fundamental quality that reads as male. A form that is not as other women's isn't just unusual, it's categorically different from female anatomy. Bearing that resembles a soldier more than a lady isn't just confidence, it's a physical presence that triggers masculine associations. These distinctions matter because Renaissance observers were perfectly capable of describing unusual women. They did it all the time. What they couldn't do was adequately describe Elizabeth, because the language they had available wasn't sufficient for what they were observing. And that linguistic failure, that struggle to find words, points towards something that existed outside their conceptual framework of possible female variation. The voice was the element Elizabeth could never fully control, no matter how carefully she managed every other aspect of her appearance and presentation. She could wear elaborate gowns that concealed her body's shape, apply thick makeup that masked her facial features, style towering wigs that added height and changed her silhouette. But voice is produced by physical anatomy, specifically the larynx, vocal cords, and resonating chambers of the throat and chest. In human biology, these structures develop differently based on sex hormones, creating distinct vocal characteristics. Adult male voices typically range from about 85 to 180 Hz in fundamental frequency. Adult female voices range from about 165 to 255 Hz. These ranges can overlap slightly, but the resonance, the timbre, the harmonic structure of male versus female voices are distinctly different in ways that the human ear is extraordinarily sensitive to detecting. We're neurologically wired to distinguish male from female voices, often within milliseconds of hearing someone speak. It's one of the most reliable and difficult to fake markers of biological sex. When multiple trained observers across different nations and languages all independently describe Elizabeth's voice as masculine, they're not making subjective style judgments. They're reporting an acoustic reality that their ears were detecting but their minds struggled to reconcile with the visual image of a woman in queenly dress. Roger Ascham, who was Elizabeth's tutor from childhood and knew her voice as well as anyone, wrote something particularly revealing in his private correspondence. He noted that her voice had a clarity and force unusual in the female sex, but also added that when she spoke at length, particularly when addressing men or discussing serious matters, her voice would settle into registers that seemed more befitting masculine oration. This observation from someone who had heard her speak thousands of times in private and public settings, from childhood through adulthood, carries enormous weight. Ascham wasn't a diplomat filing reports for foreign intelligence. He was an educator who admired Elizabeth's intellectual gifts. Yet even he couldn't help but note that something about her voice didn't align with female norms. The acoustic reality of Elizabeth's voice becomes even more significant when you consider how much of royal authority in the 16th century depended on vocal performance. A monarch's voice was their primary tool for exercising power. Elizabeth had to address parliament, command military officers, negotiate with foreign ambassadors, deliver proclamations to crowds, and assert authority over male courtiers who might challenge a woman's right to rule. She couldn't do any of this in writing or through intermediaries. She had to speak, and speak powerfully, and do it constantly in front of trained observers who were listening with professional attention to every detail. The fact that her voice consistently registered as masculine to these observers, despite the enormous social and political costs of having her femininity questioned, suggests this wasn't a choice she was making. You can't consciously lower your voice by 50 hertz and maintain that change consistently across decades of public speaking. Vocal characteristics at that fundamental level are determined by anatomy, not performance. What makes the vocal evidence absolutely devastating is that contemporary sources describe Elizabeth as highly conscious of her voice and actively trying to modulate it. Several courtiers noted that in private settings, particularly with her ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth would sometimes speak in softer, higher registers that sounded more conventionally feminine. But in public audiences, especially when stressed or exercising authority, her voice would drop into the deeper, more powerful registers that disturbed observers. This pattern suggests she was aware her natural voice created problems and actively worked to modify it, but couldn't maintain the modification consistently, especially in situations that required projecting authority. It's like watching someone who's naturally left-handed being forced to write with their right hand. They can do it with concentration, but under stress or distraction, they revert to what's natural. Elizabeth's voice would betray her in moments when she needed to command respect, dropping into registers that revealed something she was trying desperately to hide. And every diplomat in the room was trained to notice exactly these kinds of revealing inconsistencies. But the vocal observations were just one piece of a larger puzzle that was emerging from these diplomatic reports. The same ambassadors who documented her masculine voice also noted other physical characteristics that created the same cognitive dissonance. Multiple sources describe her hands as unusually large and powerful for a woman. The French ambassador specifically noted in 1564 that when Elizabeth gestured during conversation, her hands were more like those of a man than a lady, with visible strength in the fingers and breadth across the palm that seemed disproportionate. A Venetian diplomat wrote that watching her handle documents and writing implements revealed hands of surprising size and capability. These weren't casual observations. In Renaissance court culture, a lady's hands were considered one of her most important physical features, kept soft and small through careful management. Women of Elizabeth's class didn't do physical labor and wore gloves constantly to protect their hands from sun and use. Yet Elizabeth's hands apparently stood out as remarkably large and strong, even to observers who were seeing them in formal court settings, where she would have been wearing jewelry and makeup and presenting her most refined appearance. The observations about her height and build create an even clearer pattern. Multiple diplomatic reports note that Elizabeth was exceptionally tall, particularly in comparison to other women of her era. In the 16th century, the average English woman stood around 5 feet tall, while men averaged about 5'7". Contemporary descriptions place Elizabeth at close to 5'11", or possibly 6 feet tall. An extraordinary height that would have made her taller than many of the men in her court, and absolutely towering over other women. But it wasn't just height, it was how she carried that height. Diplomats described her posture as commanding, her stride as long and confident, her physical presence as taking up space in ways that seemed instinctively masculine. The Spanish ambassador noted that when Elizabeth entered a room, men's eyes tracked her movement in ways that suggested they were responding to physical dominance signals, not just royal authority. A French observer wrote that her walk had none of the grace expected of noble ladies, but rather the assured step of a military commander. These weren't descriptions of an unusually confident woman. They were confused attempts by trained observers to explain why watching Elizabeth move created such strong associations with masculine physicality. The physical stamina documented in diplomatic and court records adds another layer to this picture. Elizabeth was famous for hunting expeditions that lasted entire days, riding for 8 or 10 hours without rest, while male courtiers half her age struggled to keep pace. She could dance for hours at court celebrations, while younger women begged to sit down. Foreign visitors noted with amazement that she seemed to possess energy reserves that defied normal female physiology. When she was in her 50s and 60s, ages when most women of her era were either dead or profoundly weakened by decades of childbearing and limited medical care, Elizabeth was still riding horses aggressively, walking for miles in her gardens, and maintaining schedules that exhausted her much younger attendants. This wasn't just good health or vigorous exercise habits. Contemporary observers specifically framed her stamina as anomalous, as exceeding what should be possible for a woman of any age. The pattern emerging from these observations suggests a physical body that was producing the muscle mass, bone density, cardiovascular capacity, and hormonal profile more consistent with male physiology than female. When you compile all these observations together, the masculine voice, the large powerful hands, the exceptional height, the commanding physical presence, the unusual stamina, you get a portrait that disturbed contemporary observers precisely because it didn't fit their framework for understanding women's bodies. Renaissance Europeans had very clear concepts of biological sex differences. They believed men and women were fundamentally different in body, mind, and soul. The idea that someone might have a body that combined characteristics of both sexes, or that female appearance might conceal male anatomy, or vice versa, was literally heretical, touching on theological questions about the nature of humanity and God's creation. When diplomats observed characteristics in Elizabeth that seemed masculine, they weren't just noting political inconvenience, they were confronting something that violated their religious and philosophical worldview. This is why their reports are so careful, so circling, so full of euphemism and implication. They were documenting something that shouldn't be possible, according to everything their culture had taught them about how human bodies work. And the most terrifying part is that their observations were consistent across multiple independent witnesses who had no way to coordinate their stories, suggesting they were all observing the same objective reality. What these diplomats had discovered, what they carefully documented in encrypted dispatches and coded language, was intelligence that could have destroyed not just Elizabeth's reign, but England's entire political stability. If it became public knowledge that the Queen's physical form was not as other women's, that her voice carried masculine qualities impossible to fake or fully control, that her body displayed characteristics inconsistent with female biology, it would have triggered a catastrophic succession crisis. Catholic powers across Europe would have used this intelligence to argue Elizabeth had no legitimate claim to the throne. Protestant supporters would have fractured between those who believed the intelligence and those who dismissed it as enemy propaganda. Civil war would have been inevitable as various factions fought over who should rule. Foreign powers would have invaded to install their preferred claimants. Everything Elizabeth had built, the religious settlement, the flowering of English culture, the growing international power, all of it would have collapsed into chaos. So the diplomats who discovered her secret faced an impossible choice: report what they observed truthfully and potentially trigger the destruction of a nation, or stay silent and protect a lie that was working remarkably well. Some chose to report in carefully coded language, others chose silence. But Spanish intelligence had learned enough by 1559 to make a determination that would change everything about how European powers viewed the English Queen. If you've made it this far, you need to subscribe to this channel right now because we're just getting started on uncovering secrets that have been buried for centuries. Hit that like button if you think it's finally time someone told the complete truth about what these diplomats really discovered. And drop your theory in the comments. Do you believe these trained observers were documenting something real about Elizabeth's biology? Or is there another explanation we haven't considered? Your insights could reveal connections historians have missed for 400 years. The evidence is overwhelming, and we're going to follow it wherever it leads.